Alright guys, welcome back. I just thought I'd continue reading this book. I've got a wee bit of a cold, so excuse my bunged upness, if that's even a word. But I'm going to continue reading this book. It's really interesting. And it was one of my subs. He's in the link, is in the description below. Jason. I can't remember his surname, but he alerted me to this book, and it's really interesting. Because I've got my own theories. I like digging about ancient civilizations, the movement of peoples, languages. Where did we all come from? Where did it all start? And the Celtic culture, I've been looking into that. And the theory goes that the Celtic culture started in Austria-Hungary and spread throughout Europe and to the British Isles. But I think that the Celtic culture began in the British Isles and spread throughout Europe. Whether the culture began, something happened, like a big catastrophe, like a volcano or a tsunami or some kind of big disaster to move these people south looking for food or sunshine. And then when the ice receded or the smoke cleared, maybe the people moved back into Britain again. But it's an interesting theory that the Celtic culture started in Britain, not in Central Europe. And the same goes for the Bible, really. The Bible, to me, when I look at the Bible and hear the Bible, it's got Britain written all over it. It's got Britain written all over it. Excuse the sirens. Sake, man. But when I look at the Bible, to me it's more of a British book than a Middle Eastern book. When you see things like Jacob, and it's in the Scottish history as well. Jacob, this stone of Scone, stone of destiny in Scotland, was meant to be the stone that Jacob fell asleep on. Also the Jacobites, Jacobites, the Scots were known as the Jacobites. Well, there was a group of Scots, the Stuarts, that seen themselves as Jacobites, Jacob. The Union Jack, the flag, the Union Jack, the United Jacob. There's lots of signs that point towards Britain in the Bible. The fact that the Queen thinks she's a bloodline from King David. What if King David wasn't from the Middle East? What if King David was actually a British king? What if all these people were actually British characters but set in a Middle Eastern location? So I'm willing to look at all the evidence, because I think there's lots of discrepancies in the Bible that makes me think that it's more of a British book rather than a Middle Eastern book. And same with the Celtic. The Celtic culture, I don't think it started in the middle of Europe. I think it started in Britain and spread throughout Europe. And I've been looking at this for a while. So I want to thank my sub for making me aware of this book, and I will continue. This author, he's got some crazy, outlandish theories, but when you look at the geography and you look at the archaeological evidence, there's a lot that actually points to the truth. Like Doggerland, he believes that Orkney and Shetland in Scotland were part of like this Atlantis that's under the water now. Most of it's underwater, called Doggerland. And I showed in my last video that there was a place called Doggerland. It was in the North Sea, and the North Sea is pretty shallow when you look at it on Google Earth. But I was watching BBC 4 or 3 last night, and same again, they're coming up with brand new theories on BBC, and the documentary is called Ancient Britain. Now what was it? Britain's ancient capital, Orkney. So the BBC are now saying that the Orkney Isles were Britain's capital, and then they moved down to Stonehenge. That's what inspired Stonehenge, was this stone circle cult from up north, and they came down to was it Avebury, Stonehenge, because all these things in Shetland and Orkney predate the pyramids, they predate Stonehenge. They're the oldest remnants in Europe. So I think there's a lot of truth to this, guys. I think there's a lot of truth that we're being misled to think that a lot of this stuff started in the Middle East. I think it's right under our noses in Britain. So anyway, I'm going to continue with this book. Thanks for coming, whoever's here, just in the woods, and since Camillo. I know there's not going to be a lot of people because it's a bank holiday, it's midday, but I don't care. This is for myself as well, reading this. It's an enjoyable book. But the author so far, Comyns Beaumont, he reckons that Abraham was actually from Shetland, and Shetland was Seth land, and he reckons that Abraham went down to England and took his tribe with him, sort of thing. So you never know. These Bible stories could be rather a story of ancient Britain and the tribes in ancient Britain. It's interesting stuff. Definitely worth looking at. I'm not saying it's all true. I'm just saying the stuff that I've looked at with Celtic culture and the Bible, it kind of links into all this as well. So it's and this book's from 1948, and that documentary I was watching last night is brand new from the BBC. So this guy was onto it well over 50 years ago. So anyway, guys, I'm going to use I'll use some images and some locations just to get an idea of what we're talking about. Anyway, I'll continue from page 36. And like I said, thanks again to my sub, Jason. His channel is in the link description below. He's a flat earther, unfortunately. And I think he believes in Yahweh and all that. But I'm trying to look at this from an unbiased point of view. I'm not looking at this from a religious point of view. I'm more interested in the ancient civilization and these hidden islands, these islands that could have been buried by water, and it's all interesting to me. So anyway, enough of my rambling. I'll continue. Rufus Avenius, who possessed as well a remarkable knowledge of the British shores and probably the Norwegian Sea as well, may allude to the same region when he mentions 2 isles of the Britons in which the women danced in celebration of Bacchic orgies. When secret rites were carried on far into the night, the air rang with shouts, and the worshippers carried their fanaticism to greater excesses than even the Thracians. The more north we explore, the greater the addiction to the Dionysiac cult in the past. To return to Amnesis and the Amnites, opposite Lerwick and Bressay Sound is Bressay Island, approachable from the south through a rock-bound and dangerous piece of water, which narrows until it was reduced to half a mile in the width opposite Lerwick Harbour. It faces Bressay Island, 6 miles long by 3 in breadth, having many high caves, that best known being the Cave of the Bard and the Orkneyman's Cave, a vast cavern roofed with stalactites and paved with restless sea. It is a famous landmark to mariners, towering 264 feet on the most southerly point of the island. It can answer to Cave of Alithia, the name of the Hyperborean Artemis, and her character as patroness of women in childbirth. Other names hereabouts are curious. Bressay itself is said to be a corruption of Bardsey, the Isle of the Bards, or Boreades, and also known as the Giant's Isle. Mr. Watmore contends that Bard was a rendering of Boread or Poleman, and we know from Diodorus that the Boreads, who were bards, had charge of the round temple of Apollo on the Hyperborean island in the north, where they sang hymns to the god from the equinox to the coming of the Pleiades. The isles lay opposite to the Celts. This may be reference to the stones of Stennis and Orkney. In the Norse tongue, the word bardi signifies a giant, and on Bressay this interpretation is perhaps supported by the name of Giant's Leg, given to the extremity of the Bard to the outward bastion of beetling cliffs. Another odd name occurs in this area. Separated only by a narrow chasm from Bressay Island stands the Isle of Nos, which rises to an inclined plane on its southern side, where it presents a precipitous cliff rising to 600 feet at the noop. The face of the cliff broken up by a remarkable labyrinth of lofty caverns, honeycombed with sea corridors, into whose depths few care to venture far. Such a web of sea arcades needs little fancy in order to picture it as a marine temple devoted to the Cretan deity Poseidon. So guys, we'll have a quick look at this place. What was it called? Bressay Island. Bressay and Nos, Shetland. I've already been on this one. So there's Bressay here. Nos, west of Nos. And this is where they say they maybe get the word Gnosis, Nos. But with a G. Gnosticism. Nos. I beg to draw attention to the name Nos in conjunction with the Boredes and Bards, and the likely identification of Bressay sound with the amnesis in close proximity to Gnosis, or Knossos. According to Homer, this word Nos may be related to the veiled and the mysterious prehistoric city of whose details we know so little, except that it possessed a famous temple to Poseidon, and the labyrinth where the man-eaten Minotaur was rampant. Yet we may gather from Homer that at the time of the Trojan War, the streets were filled with men of diverse speech, creating a confusion of tongues. Achaeans some, he says, and some indigenous, Sidonians, plume-waving Dorians, and the divine Pelasgi. Note that adjective divine of the Pelasgi. Here we may be sure arose the first most ancient priestly sect known as Gnostics, the sons of Seth. Astronomers, philosophers, and scientists, the men of the divine knowledge. The name was derived from the root yono, signifying know, perceive, understand, cognate with mnornov, divine knowledge or wisdom, hence Gnostics, those who professed and taught knowledge but implying divine knowledge. It was probable explanation of the name of the city Noaman, the word no, and more derivative from signifying the city of the divine in knowledge Ammon, otherwise Hermes, his sacred city. It is thus at least possible that the name Nos preserves for posterity in that extraordinary method of persistence which so many place names possess. The site of the ancient Cretan capital Nos, and that here stood the famous Mount Ida, the sacred and venerable city of Asgard of the followers of Odin, the ward or the city of the gods, which the Voluspa describes as where the Azar met, raised on Idavol, altars and high temples. They played chess on the grass plot, lacked nothing of gold. The later Edda says that the sons of Bor raised altars and temples on the Idavol, and there the rulers met. It was no lofty mountain. Bor is the root of Bored and Boredes, the north, and it may also be of Ur, for it is also rendered Bor, Bur. In fact, I have suspected for years that the Cretan Knossos was Ur of the Chaldees. The Isle of Knos may have played its part in the long ago with its vast caverns which recall the labyrinth haunted by the Minotaur, for whom, according to mythology, Pasiphae, wife of Minos, conceived a violent passion whereby that monarch ordered Daedalus to build the labyrinth caves in which the victims of the sacrifice were hurled to indulge the appetite of the monster. It makes no difference to the toll of tragedy enacted through the ages in the guise of religion, if, in fact, the Minotaur were only a brass idol of a man with a bull's head to whom human beings were being sacrificed, or if Pasiphae's passion meant no more than that she was a pious woman according to her lights, but we may believe the labyrinth itself existed. So I think the author, Comyns Beaumont, is saying that a lot of these Greek stories are actually from the north. They've been plagiarised from the north. And that Knossos wasn't in Crete, it was actually in Shetland, known as Nos. And the name still exists to this day, Nos, the Isle of Nos. Imagine then that here, in the now remote Isle of Nos, human life was sacrificed to Poseidon and the labyrinth caves were utilised for that purpose. The highlight on this procedure is that Minos imposed on the defeated city of Athens as a tribute to the descendant of her most noble and beautiful youths and maidens who were offered to the Minotaur for his delectation. Poseidon was above all else a maritime deity, but one who sent earthquakes and who had to be propitiated. In the case of the labyrinth, set by the seashore, it is likely inference that the impenetrable caverns of Nos may have been utilised to sacrifice the victims to the god. It is not difficult to conjecture the fate of those noble Athenian youths and maidens who, after sailing to Knossos, were thrust into one or other of the entrances to the caves from above, and left in utter darkness until they expired of hunger, thirst, exposure or terror, clutched finally in the embrace of the waves, whose merciful release was kindlier than the human tyrants who exercise such cruelty. They may have been fettered and thrown down to the steep, slimy and pitch-dark maze of arcades into the eerie silence broken only by the lapping of the hungry waves below. To escape such a death did Ariadne traditionally give Theseus a cord to spin out and thus enable him to retrace the pathway. Homer made Minos a son of Zeus by Europe, daughter of Phoenix, king of Tyre, which goddess was unceremoniously whisked away by Poseidon, who emerged from the sea in the form of a bull when she was picking flowers on the seashore at Sidon, attended by her 7 maidens, and carried her on his back to Crete. Europe has been compared with the Cretan goddess Britomartis, or Dictina, as well as Artemis. Dictina, an epithet of Artemis, was related to Dictyon, a fishing net, as she was especially the protectress of fishermen. Dicte was the name of a height in Crete where Apollo and Artemis, his twin sister, were brought up. Although Dorn at Delos, which famous small island I have claimed in my earlier volume, was the present Iona, they were both notably gods of Hyperborea, and their close relationship to Crete points to the identity of Hyperborean island beyond the north wind. Crete developed her own mines, but in using the name of Crete it should be recognised that her territories undoubtedly incorporated much of the mainland. We hear of the Dactyli who laboured on Mount Ida, where it was claimed that they first discovered the uses of copper and iron. Also, rhythm and music, presumably the rhythmic music of the smith's hammer as he struck the metal on the anvil. In Rhodes, an island governed by Crete, were the Telchines, workers in brass and iron, who were credited with founding the sickle of Cronus Saturn and the trident of Poseidon. Minos himself was a patron of science, as witness his employment of Daedalus, who fled to him for protection from Athens, although later, owing to his tyranny, Daedalus with his son Icarus escaped from him by flying in the air, he having invented the means of flight. Apocryphal as such a tradition may seem, there was no reason to prevent Daedalus from having invented some air flight contrivance, perhaps on the principle of the glider. Traditionally it was deposited by Daedalus in a temple dedicated to his famous pioneer of flight on the island of Euboea, where he alighted although Icarus fell into the sea and was drowned. Such a possibility can be conceived by the present generation, for we are now air conscious and, in fact, much evidence exists to prove that the ancients at the time of the flood had mastered the secrets of flight and hyperborea. Interesting. Even if it was just a glider, that would be interesting. Minos was stated by Herodotus to have lived 3 generations antecedent to the war with Troy, but I consider the revision of ancient chronology that this period was some 3 centuries before the flood. Homer makes Diocletian a son of Minos, a generalization relating to origin often, but at least after Minos, and it also links perhaps Noah and Diocletian, for Noah was the son of Seth, or Sheth, or Shetland, as on the above shown was Diocletian. Minos become after death a judge or ruler of the underworld of Orcus, is said by Herodotus to have been extremely angry when Crete took up arms on behalf of Agamemnon against Troy, a credible attitude since Troy was a daughter of Crete, founded by Teucer and his son Tros, and that the Cretans, although Pelasgic, were not of the race of the Argives of Agamemnon or the Achaeans of Achilles. The day dawned when Crete suffered eclipse. Something dramatic took place. Ill fortune dogged her footsteps from the day when Minos wantonly attacked Sicania. Herodotus says that she lost a great many of her sons as a result of Minos' invasion of that island, and as subsequent war with the same people, the survivors never returned to their homes but settled in Iapygia. The Persians say, recounts Herodotus, that the Minos' death, men of various nations now flocked to Crete, which was stripped of its inhabitants, but none came in such number as the Hellenes, and there is no reason to think by Hellenes he referred mainly to Dorians. But this invasion of a country which had lost its proud position suggests a considerable upheaval, politically or otherwise. Right, where was I? Again, after the Trojan War was more disaster befell her, and she was a second time stripped of her inhabitants, only a remnant only being left. It is somewhat strange that these vicissitudes seem to fit in with the events relating to the Israelites as told in the scriptures, for they were overrun after the death of Solomon, when there were a violent split between the tribes, and later the Shalmaneser stripped her of her inhabitants and left only a mere remnant behind. There is such a much closer relationship between biblical and classic events than historians appreciate. Not very much later, after the Trojan War, generally placed as at circa 1184 BC, but probably for reasons to be explained subsequently, some 150 years later, Virgil, who derived his information from sources we cannot now ascertain, paints a vivid picture of Crete's collapse. He describes in the Aeneid how Aeneas sailed from the Troy after its fall to Hellas or Greece, but that a southwest wind blew the Trojans from the Cyclades to Crete, the isle described as the ancient seat of the Curetes, where the plague and pestilence were now rife, and trees and corn had been destroyed by the star Sirius. Zeus had forbidden the Trojan refugees to land on Crete's shores, but they heard that its king, Idomeneus, had been deposed and banished. The land was deserted, and the palaces and house of Knossos had been forsaken. Something phenomenal must have taken place to account for this serious state of affairs, and it may have been related to the untoward meteorological events after the sack of Troy, when Nemesis seems to have descended on the Argive heroes. We learn of terrible earthquakes and tempests, of mountainous seas, of ships being wrecked or driven headlong by storms to distant shores, from whence the heroes never returned, so that nearly all the leaders, except Agamemnon, who was murdered by his wife's paramour, and Menelaus, who sought refuge in Egypt, either died or were dispersed. While great poets of classic times, whose task it was to depict the epic stories of the heroes, poets like Aeschylus, Pindar, Euripides, and Virgil himself spun verses on the great deeds, the sombre fact remains that the destruction of Troy, there was an entire change in the populations and a wide exodus. We can only conjecture what lay behind this remarkable situation. The Orphic Argonautica offers us a certain solution. Therein, the island of Crete is referred to as Lactonia, after Lyctus, the later capital mentioned by Homer. The Argonautica speaks of the ancient Lactonia as divided or split into separate islands, and relates how Poseidon, in anger with father Cronus, struck Lactonia with his golden trident, from which we may deduce that earthquakes smote the ancient island and broke it into many smaller particles. As in the case of Shetland, in more prosaic terms, Josephus described the fate of the Sethites. God turned the dry land into sea, and thus were all these men destroyed. Its fate recalls the words of the Scandinavian Völuspá of such an event. Surtur from the south winds with seething fire, the falchion of the mighty one, a sunlight flameth, mountains together dash, giants headlong rush, men tread paths to hell, and heaven is rent in twain. Here and there lies a possible explanation of the deserted countryside, cities, towns and palaces, and houses swept away or left in utter ruin, their uninhabitants either dead or led away previously by their wise men to other climes before the final crisis. It is recorded that the astronomers were advised beforehand, like Noah or Deucalion, of impending disaster, which is largely the theme of the book of Enoch, concerned with the subject of the flood and those who lived at the time. It is not invidious to mention in this connection to the Aztec or Toltec legends of Mexico, whence they migrated from the east. One of these traditions described in dramatic language the last days of the city named Tolan or Tula or Tullan, a name very near to Thule, the early name given to Shetland, as Ultima Terra, a city also described as the city of the seven caves, well able to apply the caverns of Brescia and Nos, where they taught that civilization first began. It is described as a very great city, with streets, palaces, and ruled by a god king. Its last days speak of a bloody war, a revolution, volcanic eruptions, extraordinary meteorological phenomena, pestilence, starvation, the desperation of the populace, leading finally to wholesale flight, and then the catastrophe, when visited later by the people called Chichimex under the chief named Xolotl. They found the capital abandoned, its fortress, temples and palace in ruins, and the streets overgrown with vegetation. It is a Mexican memory of the last days of Crete or Atlantis. Interesting. I'll be back in 5 minutes, guys. Right guys, I'm back. Sorry about that. I had to give my missus a hand with her shopping. I'll just edit that out. Anyway, where was I? Right. And while we are concerned with this aspect of the past, are we wise to ignore the contentions of Tacitus in the history of the Jews when he states that Crete was their motherland, in view of the very close relationship between Crete and the Chaldees in the city of Ur, from whence Abraham led his followers to the south? Such a claim has at least a right to our consideration, for Chaldea was the mother of the Israelite tribes, or of most of them. In matters such as this, we should now show respect to the character of our authority. Tacitus was one of the greatest of Roman historians, honoured by the emperors Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, the son-in-law of Agricola and the friend of Pliny the Younger. Moral dignity, consciousness of truth, and integrity stamp all his works, in addition to which he had considerable knowledge of the northern countries, including Britain. We have therefore no justification for ignoring his views, because his history of the Jews, or those among whom some became known as Jews later, does not happen to agree with the conventional acceptance of their history and settlements. Tacitus would have been more accurate, perhaps, had he described them as Hebrews, or known in British prehistory Iberes or Iberi, in which only a variation of the same name. And this is what I was looking at, guys. Like the Iberians were Celts in Spain and Portugal. So the Iberi were Celts, and I thought, were the Hebrews Celts? I started linking the Hebrews with Celts. And when you look at the name Hebrew, and it's interesting. The thing is with the British Israelism, they think that after the Exodus, the tribes are split up and they went through Europe. Where I think that the Bible's maybe telling a story of it happened in Britain and the tribes spreading out through Europe to the east rather than west. Tacitus declares that traditionally the Jews ran away from the island of Crete and settled themselves on the coast of Libya, at the time when Saturn was driven out of his kingdom by the power of Jupiter. What he evidently signified was which these people fled at the time of the Great Catastrophe or Flood, which I have sought to prove in my previous work, was 1330-1322 BC. No fabulous date at all, but based on astronomy. Tacitus is disposed to trace their names of the Judea from Mount Ida in Crete, whose neighbouring inhabitants, he says, were called Idaei. If this were the case, the Judeans could claim most illustrious descent. The origin Tacitus explains in this manner. Some say they were the people that were very numerous in Egypt under the reign of Isis, and that the Egyptians got free from that burden by sending them into the adjacent countries under their captains Hierosolumus and Judas. The greatest part say that they were those Ethiopians from whom fear and hatred obliged to change their habitations in the reign of King Cepheus. There are those who report that they were Assyrians who wanted lands, got together and attained part of Egypt, and soon afterwards settled themselves in cities of their own in the land of the Hebrews and the parts of Syria that lay nearest to them. Others pretend the origin to be more eminent, and that the Ptolemy, a people celebrated in Homer's poems, were the founders of this nation and gave their own name, Hierosolymia, to the city which they built there. Although there are some garbled statements in the foregoing, on the whole, Tacitus does not appear to be very wide off the truth. It is largely a question of ancient geography.
The Ethiopians, for example, were the same as the Pelsagi, and they were Phoenicians or Israelites, whichever word be preferred. In another chapter, Tacitus correctly says that the Idaea means Abraham from Mount Ida or Ur gave them their god Saturn and caused them to change their abode. There were undoubtedly a very ancient relationship between the islands of Crete, the Chaldeans and the Israelites, as also with King Solomon, who so closely compares in outstanding characteristics with King Minos. The subjects of Minos were even called Salome. Sarpedon, a relation of Minos, driven from the kingdom by that tyrant, sailed with his followers to Lycia, and his fallen were designated Salome, speaking the Phoenician tongue. It gives point to Tacitus' assertion that the Salome were the founders of the Jews, or more properly, of the Judeans. There was certainly much closer contact between Hiram of Tyre and Solomon than accords with even friendly relations between monarchs, for Hiram furnished Solomon with all the gold he needed and sent him 60 talents of gold, an enormous sum for those times. There was a strange usurpation of the throne by the boy Solomon, covertly supported by Hiram, the head or hierarchical head of a state, great antiquity, power and wealth, the city which dispensed crowns, says Isaiah, whereas the kingdom of Israel, created really by David, after he and his tribes had been driven away from the Canaan by Philistines, and compelled by defeat to a new home elsewhere, had succeeded in capturing the city of Jebus, renamed it Jerusalem, where he established a new state, without a background, impoverished and small in numbers, but which was assisted from the first by lavish gifts from Hiram of Tyre, who emerged as patron and supporter of David and Solomon. The renowned Solomon's career so far, as the Bible is concerned, gives an elusive account in which little of his activities is related, except for a few isolated, outstanding events, so that how much time he spent actually in Jerusalem in view of the wideness of his empire and his extensive interests, especially in the vicinity of Egypt and Tarshish, to say nothing of his intimate relations with Hiram, the High Ram or Rama, is purely illusionary. This intimacy between the two rulers is most peculiar. It may be stressed by the Cretan Empire in its heyday stretched far beyond the bounds of the island itself. This is shown in the sway of the Curetes, who ruled in the districts called Aeolis, with Curetis later incorporated in Caledon or Cladon, and Aetolia or Aetolia, where among the other traditional events took place the classic hunt of the Caledonian boar. Crete's high civilization is proved by the fact that her laws and political systems were accepted as the pattern for such advanced ancient state as Athens and Sparta. Cities were ruled by cosmoi or mayors or provosts, who held office for 1 year, and they were elected by magistrates formed of past cosmoi, thus forming the senate or elders, or, in modern parlance, aldermen or eldermen. In every town of size there was the Prytaneum, the city hall, centre of civic life, where burned all the times the sacred flame of Hestia, goddess of the domestic hearth or home, daughter of Cronus, Saturn and Rhea. In the Prytaneum were entertained distinguished visitors from other states, such as foreign embassies or citizens who had rendered outstanding service to the state. Others to whom were accorded the freedom of the city, no empty honour in those days, or those who were feted before setting out to form a new colony in some distant region. Civic hospitality took the form of public banquets at which guests were honoured. Where did Britain obtain her almost exact counterpart of this admirable system, other than that as handed down by our Pelasgic ancestors? It is true that the municipal institutions were not discernible in England and the time of the Danish invasions of the 9th and 10th centuries, but the Roman conquest and subsequently the disordered state of the country, much internecine strife did not lend themselves to peaceful civic institutions, since rulership was that of the sword. Probably these customs went underground or lay fallow. But it is a strange coincidence to those who may not accept the contentions that practically all the names used in regard to civic government bear a root relationship to the name of Britain. In its Welsh rendering viz. Praeton or Pretin, like Prytaneum, already referred to, magistrates were called Prytanians, or in Rhodes, Prytanes. The president of the council in Athens was a Prytanis, and every high executive post, Prytania. Aristotle called the British Isles the Nesoi Prytaneicae. Cretan civilization, the further back we seek, is redolent of the Homeric age, where warfare and chivalry went hand in hand. The chiefs occupied their time, apart from warfare, in hunting, swordsmanship, wrestling and boxing. They were addicted to athletic games, playing at ball, chariot racing, and all outdoor exercises in which merit prevailed. Everything was, however, based on warfare, and like the later Dorian Spartans, who owed much to Crete, the main aim was to instruct the youth as well as the citizens of more mature years, to devote themselves to the needs of the state before all else. Monastic settlements existed from the most early ages, instituted by the Gnostics or later Orphics, or as they might be termed, the Chaldees. In conjunction with these were the Sysistia, or public tables, where all persons were free to dine in common, a custom said to have been originated by Minos himself, recalling what Herodotus says about the Meropes, where persons were able to enjoy free meals at the table of the sun. Open hospitality also prevailed with the chieftains, where bards were made welcome, and after being entertained in the banqueting hall, were invited to amuse or instruct those present with songs, epics or tales, mainly devoted to the actions of the gods or the deeds of the heroes. Cretan institutions were greatly extolled by writers of antiquity, although Aristotle accorded them qualified praise. Such then was prehistoric Crete, her people the divine Pelasgi, or Homer, the only race perhaps justly entitled to answer to the men of old, men of renown, who were destroyed according to the precept because they fell away from their former high estate, or, like the Atlanteans, described by Plato as the original race of the highest character and qualities, who fell from grace for the like reasons and were similarly afflicted by the gods. The logical explanation of the crowning sin, as I suggest, was that the ruling peoples at the end of the Bronze, or in the early Iron Age, had employed the science of the black art, otherwise known as magic, signifying the development and extended use of explosive weapons, including guns and gunpowder, the forbidden fruit of the Garden of Eden. The outcome of it was a cruel and prolonged war of conquest in the 14th year, which both allies and foes were destroyed in large part in the ensuing great catastrophe. The idea behind the belief of the cause of that disaster may have been that the secrets of the nature are gradually probed by humanity through the various ages until each has travelled its allotted span, involving new inventions and discoveries, especially in scientific evolution, until, having attained its zenith, a new world catastrophe strikes civilization, a blow of the first magnitude, and its survivors painfully climb the paths anew. Plato hints at this in the Critias. Our own age, with the discovery of the atom bomb and other scientific devilish devices, may be nearing its allotted end. Applying the lessons of Crete specifically to the British Isles, it appears that the earliest peoples, Pelasgi, Eloids, Uranids, Hellenes, and Iberis, can be retraced to their first habitats. The Hellenes, as I detailed in my former work, dwelt mainly in western Scotland and the Hebrides, and were closely related to those early Egyptians, who stretched southwards and westwards to Somerset and also had close contact with Northern Ireland. In the Western Islands, the Pelasgi nevertheless occupied a good part of Argyllshire, with their colonies such as the Magnetes and Ferries, and the Athenians, it is known, were partly of Pelasgian descent. It's funny because the city I live in, Edinburgh, we're known as the Athens of the North. That's what the city is known as, the Athens of the North, because of the architecture and the culture. Yet, just as Scotland is racially divided lengthways by the Eastern Caledonians or Picts, and later Scots, and the Western by the Celts or the Iberes, so in prehistoric days the same racial division applied. The true Pelasgic or Cretan lands included Sutherland, Ross and Cromarty, Inverness and all territories east of the Grampians, and Breadalbane ranges to the Firth of the Forth. In this eastern division, Hellenic, extra-Peloponnesian states existed, such as Calydon or Calydon, but they were originally Pelasgian. And whilst the glamour of past civilization radiates from the Ionians, who seem to have been racially Iberes, and especially from the Athenian world, the solid political and commercial hegemony lay in those eastern territories, which include Macedonia and part of Thrace, from whom the Caledonians, such as the Cassai, the Catti clan, are descended, but whose past histories is obscure as yet. Eventually it will emerge that they are the original Chaldeans and Cimmerians. In short, until the flood epoch, Crete was the pivot of world affairs, and the Shetland and Orkney Isles were its heart, straddling Scandinavia and Britain. Only by a recognition of this geography, supported by prehistory, topography and folklore, I suggest we retrace its past eras with any accuracy. So that's crazy. That's a crazy theory to have. Such a contention as I put forward is confronted with many years' study of the antiquities of Crete in the Mediterranean by the late Sir Arthur Evans, which island, called Crete or Candia, he asserted was a great motherland of antiquity, and proffered evidence in support of a claim which to the general reader was merely a restatement of a dogma. Yet all the facts oppose his theories. Although he dissected such antiquities as he could discover and published many learned tomes on the subject, they weigh up to nothing concrete at all. Like so much else in classic and Bible archaeology and legendary relics, etc., his finds have been distorted to fit in with the preconceived theories. Believing without any inquiry as to whether the Mediterranean Candia of today was the real motherland of Crete, he assumed it without question and accordingly exploited his ideas. In his principal work, The Palace of Minos, he says, "For the first time there has come to view a primitive European civilization, the earliest phase of which goes back far beyond the first dynasty of Egypt. For all that, he cannot produce one relic which dates back earlier than merely the Neolithic age. The topography of Candia alone should have made him hesitate. It is entirely extremely mountainous, and except on the flanks of 4 ranges, rocky and unfertile, with few productive tracts and without any minerals. Mount Solorite, 7,670 feet, is identified as the ancient Mount Ida, whose highest peaks are always snow-covered, and yet the traditional Mount Ida was not a high mountain. The Dactyli in far ancient days were said to have mined copper and iron at Mount Ida, but not a sign of such ores has been discovered in Candia, although at its eastern extremity at Chrysocamino, copper ore was smelted in a cave, as shown by the presence of scoria, cinders and fragments of crucibles, but the smelting of copper in a cave does not justify a claim that copper was mined there, as another writer, D'Angelo Mosso, has contended. Indeed, the strata of calcareous dolomitic breccia refutes any such claim, and smelting is no more of a proof of the existence of copper than in the neighbouring islands of Gozo and Spakia, where traces of smelting exist. As Candia, unlike Shetland, has never been torn apart, battered down and partly submerged by celestial action, the absence of either copper or iron offers at least a negative proof to Evans' claims. When we come to its antiquities, nothing, I repeat, earlier than the Neolithic period can be discovered despite immense excavations at great expense. Neolithic remains are numerous for what they are worth, including objects from caves, rock shelters, isolated buildings and settlements, including stone axes and obsidian knives, as well as pottery. There is nothing of the Paleolithic or Old Stone Age at all. Quite incredibly, the island where mankind had traditionally first evolved civilization, nor is there a trace of megalithic monuments so frequent in the British Isles, as well as many examples of the Paleolithic and Neolithic ages, and as far as found in the Shetland Orkney groups. Sir Arthur Evans and his disciples have remained discreet on this great obstruction to their claims, but they are not in a position to explain it. It makes his boast of a prior phase of civilization earlier than the first Egyptian dynasty become merely ludicrous. Candia possesses several examples of prepared copper, particularly at Hagia Triada near Phaestus, including 19 large ingots, also double-headed axes, a design found on several walls. So we've got some pictures here. This is a labyrinth of the lofty caverns on the Isle of Nos, Shetlands. And this is where the author says that the word Nos, Gnoss, comes from, because apparently wise men lived on this island. The author seeks to prove that Avebury Circle was a biblical Mizpah, a heap of stones, and also was the Cadmean Thebes or Albaris. Fallen monoliths been restored to their positions by the Morven Institute directed by Mr. Killier. One of the great stones of the early Bronze Age, such sacred stones must not be touched by stonemasons. A huge monolith weighing over 70 tons, the author is seated below it. One of the great stones of the early Bronze Age, such sacred stones must not be touched by stonemasons. Right, so no one's allowed to take stone from that. So that was a double-edged axe. An emblem by no means means limited to the present Crete, but present in many prehistoric cave engravings in the British Isles and Scandinavia. It seems to be related to the double or two-headed hammer or mallet of Thor, a symbol of Odin and his cult, which is said by Count d'Avelia to have been a variation of the thunderbolt of Zeus. That connects the emblem with the North, if at all, and is not aboriginal. Bronze was also found in Candia, including knives, daggers and double-headed axes, probably votive designs, and one from Hagia containing 18% of tin, which came from Britain. So Candia proclaims the original Crete, motherland of men, can only reveal active occupation from the Neolithic to the Bronze Age. There is not a trace from the Iron Age. Evans claimed to have discovered this palace of Minos at his alleged city of Knossos, and also the labyrinth. Archaeological examination of the place revealed it rather as a temple than as a residence. The west wing, Evan admits, was a sanctuary with frequent repetition of the double axe and a number of small shrines of pillared crypts designed for ritual use, having corresponding halls above. The throne room had an elaborately carved seat in the centre with stone benches around it, where white griffins guarded the entrance to an inner shrine, also for religious purposes, says Evans. The sole clue for its builders is supplied by the symbol of the griffins guarding to the entrance to the inner shrine. The griffin was an emblem of the Hyperborean Apollo. If any inference may be drawn from it, the builders of the palace were the Hyperboreans, either for Britain or Scandinavia, and in the latter country helmets bearing the griffin crest have been found in barrows. That's the Welsh. That's on the Welsh flag, the griffin. So whether it's the double axe or the griffin, the indications point to the probable occupation of Candia by a northern people, possibly the Pelasgi or the Phoenicians. This in no way supports the claim made by Sir Arthur Evans. His alleged labyrinth transpired to be no more than a disused subterranean quarry, So futile is the sight to explain away the age-old traditions of its size and complications that Evans evidently decided instead to discredit the legend of Theseus and Ariadne and the Minotaur, having discovered in the palace bull catching scenes in relief on the gates and fresco panels of a bull ring in which youths and girls are taking part. He contended that the labyrinth tradition was an exaggerated fable. He attributed the story to Athenian chauvinism and concluded or advanced the view that the pleasant and friendly bull catching by boys and girls went far to explain the myth. In other words, he dismissed it because his labyrinth was far apart from the legend, as were the youths playing with an affable bull, as depicted on frescoes from those unhappy victims of the Minotaur who were sacrificed. But Sir Arthur Evans thereby dismissed with contumely such of galaxy of famous names of the past who recounted the Theseus and Minotaur legend, as included Plato, Xenophon, Apollodorus, Helianicus, Sappho, Bacchylides, Euripides, and Homer in the Odyssey. We have greater support that even such a galaxy of classic writers in one historical fact, the feat of Theseus who destroyed the Minotaur, and Theseus who destroyed the Minotaur and caused thereby abandonment of the Athenian victims in the future, was celebrated annually by the ceremony of dispatching his ancient, much-betimbered old ship to Delos to take part in the solemn thanksgiving, and during its absence from the Piraeus on this mission, it was unlawful to put any person to death under sentence, and this is especially memorial because the death of Socrates was thereby delayed for 30 days. Therefore we possess historical warranty for the reality of the event. It seems to the ship was originally brought back Theseus, and so when Sir Arthur Evans dismissed the whole subject as Athenian chauvinism, he talks of a myth. He invites scepticism as to the value of his other claims. It would be surprising that serious attention were paid to such efforts, except that most persons who give the subject any thought merely hold a conventional acceptance that the so-called Crete must have been the Crete of Minos, although, as all traditions and evidence indicates, the original island was situated in Oceanus, namely the Atlantic, and nowhere near the Mediterranean. As it is not my purpose to use more space than essential to refute false ideas, all I need to add is that there is nothing of any antiquarian value in Candia which supports in one iota the claim that it was motherland of the Pelasgi people, the pioneers of the civilization which has come down to us. Even the pottery of Candia shows no indigenous origin and resembles that of Mycenae. The fact that it can reveal no civilization before the Neolithic age begins to show conclusively that it should be dismissed from our minds as having any part of the parcel in the claims made for it. So he's just writing at Crete now. I think he's just saying that it wasn't really Crete, it was the northern European islands. In my former volume, a good deal of space was accorded to denote the original Thessaly, scene of the Deucalian flood, as actually including the Inverlochie region at the present Caledonian Canal, with the river Speen answering to the Thessalian Peneus, and instancing the elevated beaches on the adjoining mountains as the residue of that tremendous deluge. In Greek geography, beyond Thessaly lay Claydon and Pleuron, highly mountainous and very inaccessible country, which originally went by the name of Aeolus. It was ruled in prehistoric times by the Curetes of Crete and was sometimes called Curetis. These names suggesting its relationship to Crete, the Metris or motherland. It was a rocky Claydon of the poets and was the scene of the epic hunt of the Caledonian boar. I ventured to recall this epic briefly as it surely belongs to Scotland and not our friends in the Mediterranean Greece at all. The heroes concerned in it includes Boreas, king of Thrace, Aeneas, king of Claydon, whose lands were ravaged by the monster because he was unwise enough to omit the northern goddess Artemis from the sacrifices, and Meleager, his son, who was one of the crew of the Argonaut in its epoch-making voyage, who loved the beautiful Atlanta. He first reached and wounded the boar, and in the division of the spoils, because Meleager gave her the head and hide as trophies of the chase, and led to a savage feud in which the cuirassiers of Pleuron assailed the walls and gates of Claydon, where Aeneas ruled. In the chain of the Grampians, east of Lochaber mountains, lies Athol, Aetolia, formerly one of the wildest parts of the Highlands, where there is yet a mountain spur named the Duke of Athol's Boar, very possibly the scene of the slaying, and where Meleager presented the main trophies to the beautiful virgin huntress Atlanta. In the south of the Athol country, all of which was formerly part of the famous Caledonian forest, lies the seat of the Dukes of Athol, close to the ancient town of Dunkeld, once an important centre of the Chaldees, and doubtless of the Curetes or Gnostics in their day. Containing the ruins of the fine cathedral built in the site of a former pagan temple. Dunkeld signifies the dun or fortress of the Keld, otherwise Khaled or Caledon, and with every likelihood was the ancient city of Claydon. In this Caledonian country, engraved stones have been found of a boar, perhaps emblematic of Artemis, to whom the boar was sacred and the northern goddess of the chase. The names have scarcely altered throughout the long centuries, showing how invaluable place names may be in identifying sites. Claydon or Claydon has become Caledonia, and Aetolia is Athol, a very slight alteration in the Greek name, while if they want further confirmation of this site, the name of Atlanta infers a goddess or nymph in the Atlantic regions. Throughout these parts of Scotland, beginning just beyond Dunblane, another ancient Chaldee centre stretched the vast Caledonian forests, which spread northwards beyond the Moray Firth, the haunt of many savage wild beasts. At its zenith, not only were there wild boars, but lions, bears and wolves, beside harbouring mammoths, deer and many other fauna. It was especially noted for the immense Caledonian white oxen, or aurochs, which had a tremendous span of horns, and was a most formidable beast to meet face to face. Hector Bos, the old Scots historian, says, in the wood Celadon, these white oxen with crisp and curling manes like fierce lions, and their enormous length of horns, were imbued with such hatred of men that they avoided any forest glades or depths if they could so much as scent a man's hand or footprint. They were so wild that they died untamed in captivity, and if a man crossed their path they charged him with terrible speed, taking no fear of hounds, sharp lances or other weapons. Robert Bruce was nearly killed by one of these savage bulls. I may recall in connection with the foregoing that Herodotus described the mountainous regions of Paeonia and Thrace, and Macedonia both Pelasgic but not Hellene, through which Xerxes led his army on the way to Athens, and who mentions there was a forest region over a great area full of lions and wild beasts with gigantic horns. The lions being found in the tract between the river Nessus or Nestus and Achelos. It seems to have been memory of record with the same region, and indeed the voyage march of Xerxes to Athens, so graphically portrayed by Herodotus, can only be logically interpreted as culminating in Scotland and a considerably earlier period than usually accorded to that Persian invader. The Nessus may be readily identified with the river, and Loch Ness, where I place Magdonia, a part of the original Macedonia, lying between the present Aviemore, Kingussie and the Ness, while the river Achelous answers to the Tay, with the bleak Cairngorm mountains marking the ancient Paeonia. Be that it may, from this ancient centre of the earlier world, bearing copious witness of habitation from the early Paleolithic age onwards, flourished the Cretans or Sethites or Cushites, all racially Pelasgi, or Phoenicians or Chaldeans, Cimmerians or Hyperboreans. In their midst arose the great teacher Hermes, or Ham, or Ammon, who had other names in addition. To the genius of this race, as Dr. Waddell has demonstrated in his work, the Phoenician origins of Britons, Anglo-Saxons and Scots, should we attribute the original civilizations of the ancients, the Gad or Cad tribe, whose emblem was a lion rampant, known later to the Cassi or Catiland, whose first motherland was the Shetland Orkney Island. And that's what's Scotland's flag, is the rampant lion. The lion rampant.
So we're on part 2 now. I'll just end it here. I might start part 2 immediately, but I'm going to stop here for a wee break. And I hope you've enjoyed this, guys. Thanks.